invite you to take your Bibles this morning and turn once again to 1 Chronicles chapter 16. 1 Chronicles chapter 16. Again, we'll be looking at verses 7 through 24 this morning. 1 Chronicles chapter 16. Excuse me. First Chronicles chapter 16, beginning verse 7 through verse 24 this morning. Please follow along as I read from the Holman Christian Standard Bible. If you have another version, please follow along as I read. First Chronicles chapter 16, verses 7 through 24. Give thanks. Verse 7. On that day, David decreed for the first time that thanks be given to the Lord by Asaph and his relatives. Give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, proclaim his deeds among the peoples. Verse 9. Sing to him, sing praises to him. Tell about all his wonderful works. Honor his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek Yahweh rejoice. Search for the Lord and for his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wonderful works he has done, his wonders and the judgment he has pronounced. You offspring of Israel, his servant, Jacob's descendants, his chosen ones. Verse 14. He is the Lord our God. His judgments govern the whole earth. Remember his covenant forever, the promise he ordained for 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham, swore to Isaac, and confirmed to Jacob as a decree, and to Israel an everlasting covenant. I will give you the land of Canaan to you as your inherited portion. When they were few in number, very few indeed, and temporary residents in Canaan, wandering from nation to nation and from one kingdom to another, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their behalf. Do not touch my anointed ones or harm my prophets. Verse 23, sing to the Lord, all the earth, proclaim his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his wonderful works among all peoples. The word of the Lord. There's a note here on the pulpit for the church, and it's addressed to all of you. Note of thankfulness. It says this: Dear Roaring Brook Baptist Church, we've been trying to reach you concerning your vehicle's extended warranty. You should have received a notice in the mail about your car's extended warranty eligibility. Since you've not gotten a response, we're giving you a final courtesy call before we close out your file. Press 2 to be removed and placed on our do not call list. To speak to someone about possibly extending or reinstigating your vehicle's warranty, press 1 to speak with a warranty specialist. Yes, Bill. Well, some of you might chuckle at this. Others might feel like walking out. There's something to be said about this time of year between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Remember, aside from the gifts and the shopping, there's something else that lingers longer than your Thanksgiving leftovers that never got put in the fridge. And it's the time of year when you renew your contract. Renew your contract. Now, you might not have to think about this when you're young, but as you get older, become more independent, you begin to realize that there are a lot of contracts that you have in life. And November and early December is the time of year when you renew these contracts for the coming year. For many of us, this might be renewing your health insurance, your car insurance, your registration to drive. And as a teen, young adult, you might not have to worry about the health insurance contract or paying for your car insurance, but you're more concerned about your subscriptions, perhaps, your Disney Plus membership, your Amazon Prime, your Hulu. making sure your mom and dad renewed those subscriptions so you can enjoy watching your favorite shows or series. You don't want to lose out on watching those. We're talking about contracts, renewing of contracts. Today, again, we have a budget meeting, a nominating committee, right after or in the middle of, at the end of church. For some of you, hear those words and you think, why do I instantly feel a yawn coming on? Others, you feel like, others who have worked very hard to prepare the budget, they crossed their I's and dotted their T's, but the meeting itself is actually a sense of renewal and commitment to the proposed budget and even positions for serving within the church for this coming year. There's a renewal aspect of that. Our passage today is also about renewal. And really it's about God's people renewing their relationship with Him. Through what we talked about last week, the sacrifice aspect, and this week we're going to touch more on the praise, the song. But also the renewal has a lot to do with their remembering God's works and His covenant. In similar fashion, our thanksgiving, our thankfulness, our worship, we talked about last week, even our relationship to God invites a renewal to those who believe, who desire to give praise and honor to God. A renewal of our thanksgiving from year to year for what God has done in our lives and our relationship with Him. So we've been engaged in this book of 1 Chronicles 16, which has been titled A Psalm of Thanksgiving. We talked about last week, there's 3 other psalms that help compose this one chapter. But believe it or not, as we're reading this book of 1 Chronicles, that 1 Chronicles is actually written after the exile, the return from exile, which is almost towards the end of the Old Testament. And the focus of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as we've seen a little bit, is on the dynasty of David and Solomon. And in a sense, it's a very broad brush approach to the history of Israel. But in doing so, it's seeking to help remind God's people when they return from exile, remind them of their covenant with God, of God's covenant with them. It's a reminder of what God has done. So the purpose of the author, as he's writing this book, somewhat of a commentary, is to encourage his readers and remind them that just as God was with them at the beginning, so too that He will be with them in the end. Just as though God was with them through all the success and the trials of David and Solomon, so too He is with them now. God was with His people in the past, He is with them in the present, and He will be with them in the future. Something we need to hear as well today. So chapter 16 of 1 Chronicles is a pivotal point in the writer's commentary on the whole history of Israel. Not only does it describe the arrival of the ark of God to Jerusalem, but in such it presents a renewal of God's people back to Him, a focus and return that they had not seen in the leadership of King Saul. So while as a whole, Chronicles, if you read through the Chronicles, it misses a number of details regarding the faults and the sins of David and Solomon. But as we looked a few weeks ago at chapter 13, something it does not miss is David's shortcoming in his first attempt to move the ark of the Lord, like we saw a few weeks ago. David, his first approach failed even before it began. And David admits this himself in chapter 15, if you were to look at verses 13 through 15, that David says this, he confesses, he says, "For the Lord our God burst out in anger against us because you Levites were not with us the first time, for we didn't inquire of Him about the proper procedures." And verse 14 of 1 Chronicles 15 says, "So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. Then the Levites carried the ark of God the way Moses had commanded according to the word of God on their shoulders with the poles." So in regards to application, we were looking at chapter 13, building up to chapter 16 a few weeks ago. While David's intentions were right in wanting to move the ark to Jerusalem, his actions were wrong. 1 Chronicles 13:8 says that David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with songs, with lyres, with harps, tambourines, cymbals, and trumpets. But at the end of the day, David's actions were wrong. In a sense, this is a case of the end justifies the means. In other words, you set out to have a good goal that you try and reach, and then you use any means necessary to try to attain that goal. For example, let's say you wanted to give $1 million to the poor this coming year, 2024. But you don't have $1 million to give to the poor. So while there are many ways to accomplish this goal of giving $1 million to the poor, you decide to go out and rob a few banks. And then you give that money to the poor. Again, you set a good goal of giving a lot of money to the poor, but the way you went about that goal was entirely wrong. Again, David had a good goal. He wanted to bring the ark of the Lord up to Jerusalem, because in the days of Saul, they did not inquire of God, according to David. But the way he went about it was wrong. He did not invite the Levites, who God ordained as ministers before him, to carry the ark of God, to follow specific instructions, and even play musical instruments before the ark instead. Remember, they placed the ark on a cart, just like the enemies, the Philistines, did. And then when one of the oxen stumbled, remember that Uzzah reached out to steady the ark, and God's anger burned against him, and he died in the presence of the ark. And because of this, we know from chapter 13, David became fearful and angry. And he asked, how can I ever bring the ark of God to me? We saw 2 weeks ago that David's first attempt failed at moving the ark of God. And we remember that's where God's presence would reside amongst his people, the ark of the covenant. Again, chapter 13 was an example of David's right intentions, but going about it the wrong way. And David even confesses this in chapter 15, like we read moments ago. So even though David's fearful, again, he returns in chapter 15 of 1 Chronicles to gather the ark once again and bring it to Jerusalem. So David brought the ark of Jerusalem and offered 2 different sacrifices we saw last week, the burnt offering and the peace offering. The burnt offering would be put on the offering and would be completely burnt up, completely consumed. And the second one, the peace offering or the fellowship offering, would be shared amongst the people. But not only did they share amongst the sacrifice, but David went on to bless the people in light of the sacrifice by giving them bread, a date cake, a raisin cake. So all this to say that David is blessing the people, but in big picture, he's also leading the people back to God. And the example we see here is deep-rooted in what some theologians would call a covenant renewal. A covenant renewal. What is a covenant renewal? Well, just like you have to renew your health insurance every year, or your hunting license, your auto registration, or you sign a contract saying that you sign a contract saying that a company or agency will provide one service or another for you if you do X, Y, and Z. Usually shell out a chunk of cash for them to provide that service for you. So in a sense, kind of like auto insurance or home insurance, they provide you with a type of protection in exchange for an obligation of you to pay them, sum of money or some other service. In somewhat of a similar mindset, God's people were in covenant relationship with him. And again, this relationship is much more than a yearly subscription to Disney Plus. In a sense, it's a binding relationship. Many people today are trying to water down marriage to just a short-term contract. And as long as you guys agree every few years, you can continue that contract. But within the church, we would say marriage is more of a covenant, a binding agreement between 2 people. And again, I don't want to split hairs here between the words contract or covenant. But for our purposes today, think of about a covenant as an agreement made between God and his people. And that God will provide his people a service when they seek to obey and honor him. And when those requirements are not met, there's often consequences and even judgment. So last week we saw after David's first attempt at moving the ark that he again, after about 3 months, went and he brought up the ark of the Lord to Jerusalem, where we're told he built his palace and now pitched a tent for the ark of the Lord, the ark of the covenant. This time, though, as we saw, and you can read about in chapter 15, he brings the Levites with them, who were commissioned from the beginning to carry the ark of the Lord, instead of just putting it on a cart like the Philistines did and had it pulled by a bunch of cows or oxen. And so when we come back to 1 Chronicles 15, this parade, this procession is bigger than even the Macy's Day parade. We read about singers, and there were harps and lyres and cymbals and lots of music, lots of rejoicing. There was a sacrifice of 7 bulls and 7 rams. Even King David wore an ephod or a fine linen, just like the Levites or the priests who were carrying the ark of the Lord. And they brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouts and sounds of the ram's horn, trumpets and cymbals, and playing the harps and the lyres. This sounds like an incredible time. An incredible time in the life of God's people. A joyful time, a time of praise, a time of song, a time of thanksgiving. But also especially a time of remembering. Remembering what? God's covenant. What he has done for them. In the midst of celebration, in the midst of sacrifice, again, the first as a sin offering, the second as a fellowship offering or peace offering, David then goes to bless the people. But after blessing the people, we see that David appoints the Levites to be ministers before the ark of the Lord. And we see that it's not just for one day, but verse 6 of 1 Chronicles 16 tells us that Benaniah and Jeziel blew the trumpets regularly before the ark of the covenant of God. So there's at least one trumpet player here and a host of others who would play various instruments before the ark of the Lord. Imagine these two people here in verse 6 of verse 16. Benaniah and Jeziel, where their whole life, their role as priests is to play before the ark of the Lord. Think about how many people practice, let's say, the trumpet or piano from an early age. And they strive to be the very best at what they're doing. The older you get and the more practice and the more skill you have, perhaps you even invite a teacher to help you. You grow in your talent, your skill. And often that skill amounts to having one goal as a musician, is to perform in the biggest audience or setting that you can. Again, that's just one goal that some musicians have, is to play on the biggest stage possible. And for some, that's a really big reality. You might remember might know the country music star Carrie Underwood. And perhaps you remember years ago her audition on American Idol, where she came and she sang before 3 judges, and some very critical, and yet they passed her on. And you all remember that she became one of the stars of American Idol. But you think about where Carrie Underwood is now, you might see her on Sunday Night Football, where she sings before some 23 million people on Sunday Night Football. The biggest audience, the biggest glory, the biggest praise. Perhaps one of the biggest stages in the world each and every week. The goal of the performance is to play in front of the most people that you can. But what about Benaniah and Jeziel, who job in verse 6 here we're told are priests who play the trumpet regularly before the Ark of the Covenant? That's their job, to play before the Ark. While at first it was probably grand. The celebration was probably the most memorable day of their lives, as David describes here. All the people are celebrating. And probably for the first 2 weeks, it's all anybody could talk about when they're done playing is, can you remember that procession as we brought the ark and we played before the people of Israel? How great that was. And then a couple more weeks go by. a couple months go by, and it says they played regularly before the ark, and nobody else was listening. They played before the ark of the Lord. Perhaps if their trumpet was a little off, they thought, well, who really cares? There's no one else around. It's just us and the ark of the Lord. Everyone else has gone back to work, back to their lives, back to reality. And yet their job from day one was to play the trumpet before the ark of the Lord. Not for an audience of millions, but for an audience of one. To play before the Lord. Remember one pastor reminding us many, many Sundays, as we come together for church, it's not just one person on stage performing or ministering, but in reality, all of us are on stage and we have an audience of one. The Lord. The Lord. For these two playing the trumpet, they had an audience of one. Look with me as we move through verses 7 through 24. We're recognizing Israel's response in renewing their covenant with God. Verse 7, on that day David decreed for the first time that thanks be given to the Lord by Asaph and his relatives. Give thanks to Yahweh, call on his name, proclaim his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell about all his wonderful works. Verse 10, honor his holy name, let the hearts of those who seek Yahweh rejoice. Search the Lord and for his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wonderful works he has done, his wonders and the judgment he has pronounced. You offspring of Israel, his servant, Jacob's descendants, his chosen ones. He is the Lord our God. His judgments govern the whole earth. Verse 15. Remember his covenant forever. The promise he ordained to 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham, swore to Isaac, confirmed to Jacob as a decree, and to Israel as an everlasting covenant. I will give the land of Canaan to you as your inherited portion. When they were few in number, very few indeed, and temporary residents in Canaan, wandering from nation to nation and from one kingdom to another, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their behalf. Do not touch my anointed ones or harm my prophets. Verse 23, sing to the Lord, all the earth. Proclaim his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his wonderful works among all peoples. Now again, as we remember that this chapter is so pivotal to the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's packed full of theological terms and values, not just surrounding the time of Solomon and David, but terms and values that are expressed throughout all of Scripture, especially the Old Testament. That being said, we can't unpack all of these, but for today, in simple form, I invite you to look at the very first word or first two words of verses 8 through 15. We'll simplify the importance of this passage while seeking not to diminish the importance of the larger context. So notice in verse 7, the decree of David, which says, David decreed for the first time that thanks be given to the Lord by Asaph and his relatives. Now, does this mean that this is the very first time that the people are giving thanks to the Lord? Does this mean that David just woke up one morning and said, I think we should give thanks to the Lord? Wow, that's a revolutionary idea. Why don't we think of that? No, it's not like that. Instead, this is how they were going to give thanks, by Asaph and his relatives. This is why we have this Thanksgiving psalm. But notice how it unfolds in these verses. And notice the first word of these verses. I want to draw your attention to the words, give thanks, in verse 8. The word sing to him in verse 9. Again, these are commands. Verse 10, honor his name. 11, search for the Lord. And then notice there are two ways to remember, one in verse 12 and the other in 15. Verse 12, remember the wonderful works he has done. And then 15, similar but a little different, remember his covenant forever. Now again, this is just in the way of structure, but each verse, notice, also has a complement to the first command, the first imperative. Just like you might compliment someone at church and say, good morning, George. you look very present today. That's not really a compliment. But like you're complimenting them the same the psalmist does. He's complimenting what he says. As in verse 8, he says, sing to the Lord. And the compliment or the restatement of that is give thanks to the Lord, give thanks to the Lord, proclaim his deeds among the peoples. That's the compliment. Verse 9, here's where we see, sing to him. And notice the compliment or the restatement is tell about all his wonderful works. If you're looking for something to do this week, I invite you to write down these initial commands that you see at the beginning of these verses. And then after that, write the compliment or the restatement within the verse. And then beyond that, ask yourself, can I restate this verse, this command in my own life? Can I restate this in my own life? David commands his people in verse 11, search for the Lord. Search for the Lord in verse 11. Almost ironically, the word here is the same word used in 1 Chronicles 15, verse 13. When David says to the Levites that we read earlier, for the Lord our God burst out in anger against us because you Levites were not with us the first time, for we did not inquire or search of him about the proper procedures. In other words, David is commanding his people to search for the Lord, seek the Lord, because he did not do it the first time in moving the ark. So why are they searching for God? Is God lost? Does he need to be found? No. But just like you search for your car keys, it's not that the car keys lost themselves. No, you lost your car keys. And you have to go searching for them to find them. We need to seek the Lord, search for him, because he wants to be found by us. He wants us to search after him, like children seeking their father. Search for the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always. But then after you're writing these down, ask the question, am I seeking the Lord? Am I searching for the Lord? Verse 10, going back a verse, honor his holy name. Then write down the restatement here, the compliment, where it says, let the ears of those who seek the Lord rejoice, or the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Then ask yourself, am I seeking to honor his name? Is my heart seeking the Lord? Am I rejoicing? And so on and so forth. If you wanted, you could take this section and use it as a guide for this entire next year. Asking yourself, how can I renew my thanksgiving and praise of God? Follows these verses as a way to renew not just your mind, but also your heart in praise and thanksgiving of God. Now, there's a lot more that could be said here as we prepare our hearts for communion. Again, in light of this series on thankfulness, think about these two distinct commands in verse 12 and verse 15 to remember. The first is to remember all the wonderful works that God has done. His wonders and his judgments. The judgments govern the whole earth, it says. But the second then is to remember his covenant forever in verse 15. A call here to remember God's covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. And while there are reminders here that God gave them the land, that he warned kings not to harm them, that there's also a wonderful hope in God's covenant to his people when they were wandering from nation to nation in verse 20. God's people needed this message on day one and also on the day they returned from exile and every day in between. Like God's people wandering from nation to nation, they needed something to hold on to. For some of you might be wandering around this time of year. I'm not talking about the wandering that husbands do in department stores, wondering what they should get for their wife. for Christmas, but the type of wandering in your spiritual journey, where you wonder if God has turned his back on you. You wonder if God even cares about you and your situation. Your life feels as though your trials seem to get harder. The days seem to get longer. Your loneliness seems to get even lonelier. And you wander and wander, not sure if you're on the right path anymore. We've talked about Thanksgiving. We've talked about having a heart of thankfulness. But if we're honest, some Thanksgiving we feel like putting up a fake front. Because in our hearts, we don't feel as though we have a reason to be thankful. We don't feel like we have the feeling or the sense of thanksgiving. I have an article here. It's a story about a woman named Aunt Ethel. And I'm not going to read the whole story. But it's where on Thanksgiving Day, her and her husband, their house burned down. And I believe it's a true story where she was prepping all the ingredients for the Thanksgiving meal, and some of the grease from the turkey spilled over on the oven and ended up catching their whole house on fire. And while that's such a tragedy in and of itself, this was years before they could just call up the fire department, and they would come and put out the fire. But as a family and everybody got out safe, and there was no more harm done other than the whole house being burnt up right in front of them. One of the things they were able to grab was the actual turkey. And again, I believe this is a true story, but I can't say for sure. But they grabbed that turkey, they took it outside, and they ate it on the front yard as their whole house was burning down to the ground. And even though they couldn't change the situation right in front of them, again, this would be very sad again if this actually happened. But they were able to share that turkey amongst each other and be thankful for the family that they have. And again, while I can't say for sure if it's true or not, it reminds us that in the moments of life, some of the darkest points in life, again, where we don't feel like saying thank you, that we can remember what God has done for us in the past. We can be mindful of it in the present and hold on to the hope that we have in the future. Why? Because God is faithful to his covenant for his people. That's something we can cling to for now and for all eternity. God is faithful. May we renew our thankfulness year after year for what he has done for us. Let us remember his wonderful works. Let's pray as we prepare our hearts for the Lord's table. Gracious Lord, sometimes in life it is hard to have a heart or an attitude of gratitude, a heart of thanksgiving, a heart of thankfulness for all that you've done. In God's people, we see this incredible event in the procession and the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant, and God's people are celebrating perhaps like never before in their history. And they put together this beautiful psalm of thanksgiving, not just a way of singing praise and honoring your name, searching for you, but a way in which they are remembering all that you've done, your judgments, but even your wonderful and everlasting covenant. God, as we come before your table, these two elements, your covenant and remembering, both come together in what we are about to do. And yet, Lord, as we seek to have a heart of thankfulness, a heart of thanksgiving, it doesn't always come week after week after week. But with God's people, as they are coming back from exile and trying to pick up the pieces and put them back together, put back together of their lives, they're wondering, does God still care about me? Why should he even remember us? And it's because God always remembers his covenant. So may we respond in praise of him as we remember what he's done for us. So, Lord, as we partake of communion in a few minutes, may we remember what you have done for us on the cross. Say thank you and partake. May we look to you. It's your name that I pray. Amen.